and welcome to Leaving Nothing Undared, a podcast from Oblate School of Theology's Department of Continuing Education. I'm Antonio Fritzi, your host, and today we'll be diving into the imaginative world of J.R.R. Tolkien with a very special guest, Dr. Austin Freeman. Now, Dr. Freeman is chair of Apologetics at Houston Christian University and also the author of Tolkien Dogmatics, a seminal work which explores Tolkien's theology through the lens of his stories, lectures, and letters. Dr. Freeman is going to do us the honor of leading a lecture entitled Tolkien as Apologist to the Imagination, February 27th, here at Oblate School of Theology. Today, we'll be discussing Tolkien's role as an apologist to the imagination, as well as how his works can serve as unique avenues to theological insight. Let's begin. Dr. Freeman, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Antonio. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation. I'm very excited to come and visit for the upcoming lecture. It's going to be great.
Absolutely. We're excited to have you and to welcome you to our campus. And with that kind of welcome in place, I'm eager to get started talking about the subject of the lecture. As we've noted in our introduction and in the description, you'll be talking about J.R.R. Tolkien, right? And many people know him as an author of The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings series, right? Certainly a kind of founder of the fantasy genre. But not as many are familiar with his role as a theologian and as an apologist. Can you talk to us a little bit about that role, what it's meant in your study of him, and how it can further our understanding of Tolkien?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first sentence of my book, Tolkien Dogmatics, is that this task is pretty much impossible, and for the very significant reason that Tolkien did not consider himself to be a theologian or an apologist. He was a professor of Old and Middle English, but nevertheless, because he was so deeply saturated in the Christian faith, that came out naturally in everything that he did. As his friend and fellow Inkling C.S. Lewis said, we don't really need a bunch of Christians writing Christian fiction. We need Christians doing the sort of things that they are professionally and vocationally called to do, and allowing their Christianity to shine through that. And so that's sort of how I approach this book. It is let's go through everything that Tolkien wrote, not just his fiction, but also his published lectures and his academic work, his personal letters to his family and friends and colleagues. And let's sort of gather together all of his comments about the Christian faith and organize them topically according to a systematic theology, and see what comes out. And what emerged was that Tolkien was a very consistent thinker. He was deeply influenced by Christian doctrines such as creation and anthropology. And these were the frameworks from which he navigated his view of the world. And so because Tolkien was just being a genuine person and expressing himself articulately in subjects that he cared about, people can feel that, and they feel very compelled by his vision of the world, which happens to be a Christian vision of the world. Now, significantly, before World War I, remember, Lewis and Tolkien were both veterans of the Great War. Tolkien had a group of friends that he grew up with called the TCBS. And if anybody's seen the Tolkien documentary, they know a little bit about them. But these people saw themselves explicitly to be, quote, testifying for God and truth in the world. So it's something that Tolkien felt called to do and to be as a result of his Christian faith. To be able to articulate those things and to not hide them and to not be ashamed of them. So that's the basis of my book, is to see how The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings sort of shows this spillover of Tolkien's intellectual life. And it turns out, regardless of Tolkien's intention, to explicitly be an apologist and to explicitly sort of show the compelling truth of Christianity, he does really well at it. And a lot of people find themselves wanting this sort of a world to be true.
That's incredible. And I want to, kind of ring the bell again that this is no small task to take the material produced of a life that was not intentionally or explicitly theological or apologetic and kind of divulge from that survey and systematic organization an architecture of a theology or of a manner of apologetics. It prompts me, and I'm sure our audience, to wonder what kind of theology or apologetics might be divulged from our own writings or personal entries, right, that we have with our friends and families.
Yeah.
So I applaud you for that work, and I think it's an important one that opens us to the possibility of our own kind of theologies being revealed in dialogue with Tolkien's. I
Yeah.
do want to ask, you describe Tolkien as an apologist to the imagination, right? And these are two words that might not often be encountered together. Could you speak a little bit more as to what imaginative apologetics would be and what it means in our encounter with Tolkien?
Sure. So, imaginative apologetics, sometimes also considered as a subset of cultural apologetics, and something that's been pioneered by people like Holly Ordway, other folks that uses creativity, uses storytelling to mine theological truths. The 5 minute speech of what imaginative apologetics is basically the interaction of David and Nathan. So after David has had his sin with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan comes to him and he tells him this story about a rich man who takes a poor man's lamb, and this poor man had loved the lamb and he'd had it eat at his table, and his children loved it. He creates this whole story, and the rich man takes the poor man's lamb, even though he's got plenty of his own, and he kills it and offers it to his guest. And so the prophet Nathan comes to King David and he says, "What should be done to this man who has taken this beloved lamb?" And David says, "The man is surely worthy of death." And then Nathan drops the bomb and he says, "You are the man." Now, David has been persuaded by this story. He inhabits the imaginative position of another person, and it changes his affections. It shows him the world in a different light. If Nathan would have come in guns blazing and say, "Hey, David, you need to repent of your sin of adultery," David's walls would have been up, right? So these are the sort of things that we're talking about in the lecture, is how this form of apologetics, using stories to inhabit the perspectives of other people, to say, well, let's just imagine what would happen if there was a world like this. It cultivates the affections, and it reorders our loves in order to make us open to the truths, the logical, philosophical, theological, that we otherwise would have been shut off to.
That's incredible. And again, one of the things I think is significant to note and hold in our consideration of this is that whereas we encounter fantasy, Tolkien, perhaps as these kinds of imaginative strains of creation in our culture, right? It's in many ways deeply biblical, or at least resonant with the manner of discussion and apologetic and discourse we encounter in the Old and New Testaments. And it speaks very clearly to this manner of really taking story, taking imagination, and using it as a vehicle through which theological ideas become more accessible to us.
Mhm.
I very much appreciate the example you presented and would ask that you offer another in particular. And we're getting into a little more of the deep cuts of Tolkien. So this is very exciting for me, especially. But speaking of angelic beings like the Valar, the Maiar, and in Tolkien's cosmology, could you speak to how these kinds of fantastical beings or creatures make theological ideas like angels more accessible to us?
Sure. Now, for the people that might not know, the Valar and the Maiar are created spiritual beings with immense power that God, Eru Iluvatar, commissions to sort of help govern and manage the cosmos. And the Valar are the ones who have entered into the story of history, to act as what in Old Testament theology we would call the divine council. Basically, they're the ones who are in charge of ruling and governing in place of humanity until, in Tolkien's conception, humanity comes of age. And the Maiar are their subsidiary, created angelic servants. And a lot of people don't know this, just reading The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but some of Tolkien's major characters are these angelic spirits. Gandalf, Saruman, Sauron, the Balrog, Tom Bombadil. All of these people are explicitly, Tolkien says this explicitly in his letters, angelic spirits, in the sense that they are created supernatural beings who have, in the case of the wizards, taken on bodies in order to act as messengers and guides to the human race, and in Tolkien's case, to elves and some other races as well. Now, in the 21st century, if you ask somebody, well, what role do you think an angel plays in your life? Most people wouldn't really have an off-the-cuff answer. Like, well, I guess not much. Maybe giving me positive thoughts or something. I'm not really sure. There's all sorts of false answers about the roles that angels play in our lives that you can look at on any Barnes and Noble bookshelf. But what's Tolkien doing? He's actually recovering a more biblical worldview of the relationship between angels and the material world. I use this phrase divine counsel. This is something that in systematic and biblical theology right now is seeing a renaissance. Tolkien set out, because he loved classical mythology, to say, is there a way that I can tell these sorts of stories while maintaining a monotheistic biblical worldview? And so he basically just ratchets down the Olympian gods into angels under the service of the one God. And what he does, whether intentionally or unintentionally, we can talk about that, is actually goes back to the worldview of the original Israelite audience and the New Testament audience. And so if you say, oh, well, what role does an angel play in my life? As I said before, I think all of us would be really interested to have a Gandalf somewhere watching over us, right? Gandalf is a sort of guardian angel figure. And if we can persuade people to love something imaginatively, then we've already won over half the battle in saying, well, what if I told you that the Christian faith actually has the equipment to give you a very sophisticated philosophical and theological portrait of beings that do exactly this.
And what really strikes me is again that we're talking about apologetics,
Mhm.
right? And I know this is very much your area, right? And you have many on your faculty who are experts in this, but I would note that the term apologetics today, right, often brings to mind this idea of a kind of combative, almost argumentative public square, whereas it sounds like what you're articulating and what imaginative apologetics might bear for us and help in its maintaining its relevance to today is this opportunity for a kind of fantastical wondering together that arrives or at least approaches towards a deeper understanding of the truth, even while employing metaphor and imaginative being and character. Can you speak a little more to the immense opportunity that imaginative apologetic bears for this present moment when so much of our discourse seems combative and strained?
I love what you said, wondering together. Yeah, apologetics, the Greek word means defense, right? So when somebody accuses you of something, when somebody brings an objection against Christianity, then you respond. But as you say, words and terms change, and we often see apologetics co-opted for something like a culture war. And that's not really what I'm interested in. I'm confident in the faith and that Scripture can respond to these objections, but psychologically, that's not genuinely how people are persuaded that something is true. And the ultimate goal of apologetics is not, to own the libs or any something like that. It's to win souls, and it's to convince people to give their faith to Christ. And so when you situate yourself not over against somebody, but next to someone looking at the same thing, and you imagine yourself going to an art gallery and saying, "Now look at this painting and look at the way that he uses light to illuminate this particular part of the landscape." You're directing somebody's gaze at something, and then you're no longer combatants, you're partners. And people just tend to like that more. Now, with Tolkien in particular, what I've found is I don't really have to do a ton of work because everybody loves it already. There are people that find themselves deeply impacted by these stories already, and all I have to do is sort of come in and pick up the pieces and say, well, these are the reasons why you find this so impactful, is because it's not just a fictional work. It's something that has a deep correspondence with the metaphysics of the way the world actually works. I mean, Tolkien's depiction of virtue, of community, all of these things. This is responding to the longings of the human heart that God has designed us to respond to. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like I have a pretty easy job of this. we're going along the grain of the way that God has designed us to interact and engage with other people, rather than in this sort of head-to-head combative mode.
Absolutely. And I hear a bit of the answer to my next question bubbling up. But I really do appreciate that posture you illustrate of yourself as pointing in many ways to these things that are already extant in our own tradition, right? And we've spoken just now about apologetics and of course the necessary dialogue with those who perhaps don't share the same beliefs as we do. But in addition, I think it's so valuable to have that kind of partner, instructor, tutor, and guide in really coming to recognize what's present in our own tradition. I'm a cradle Catholic in many ways, and I've had the great joy and blessing of being educated here at Oblate, and many of my professors and mentors have served in that role. So I applaud you in doing that for your students, and I really, really appreciate the opportunity for you to do that at this upcoming lecture. But you'll see me read now because I want to make sure that I get this right. Tolkien once said, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision." I'm curious how this statement really resonates with the themes of your work generally, and then particularly what you'll treat in this lecture.
Sure. So C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Mere Christianity. Tolkien is not a mere Christian. Tolkien is a Roman Catholic, and he is very clear about that. So what I wanted to do in Tolkien Dogmatics was to not be an evaluative source. I wanted to be a descriptive source, because this is what I found in the scholarship on Tolkien is you have a lot of people that are very well educated in literature, and they tend not to be very well versed in Christian theology. And then you have a lot of people that are more educated in Christian theology, or are very interested in the theology of Tolkien, but they're not many times as educated in the literary devices or the tradition of hermeneutics, or mining texts for details like this, or seeing the way in which Tolkien is part of this great conversation that synthesizes classical and pagan and medieval and all these sources in order to present something. So I wanted to sort of be a bridge builder there, and to show how Tolkien was at the same time a top tier scholar, and also an explicitly Christian thinker. And so he says it's a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, primarily unconsciously, because it comes out of his head, and that's the way he sees the world. Now, he says it's consciously Catholic in the revision, because this is what's really interesting. I get to this in chapter 2 of my book. A lot of the things that Tolkien sees coming out of his head were not originally something that he intended to put there. So, for instance, themes like the light of Galadriel that she gives to Frodo, or the sustaining power of the Lembas bread. It's as Frodo and Sam are walking through Mordor, that's the only food that they have, right? This is very much in correspondence with medieval hagiographies of saints who only subsist on the Eucharist, for instance. So we see these themes emerging, and he sort of says, well, hey, I could do something with this, right? It's already there, but I can sort of buttress it and direct people's attention to it more. And so he goes back, and for one thing, he eliminates all explicit mention of religion, which is interesting. How is that how does that make it a fundamentally religious and Catholic work? We can talk about this a little bit in the lecture. But it's because he situates it in a particular point of redemptive history. For one thing, he prioritizes the reception of Scripture and the revelation of Christ, which hasn't come yet in the point at which the stories of Middle-earth are there. But he says that he's going to make the world and the way the world works consonant with the undergirding assumptions of the nature of humanity, the purpose of our lives, what redemption looks like, ethics, all of those sorts of things. It's a complicated endeavor. And when we're looking at Tolkien's theology, we have to do a little bit more digging than we would with somebody like C.S. Lewis or even somebody like Flannery O'Connor. It's more embedded in the whole scope of what his scholarship looks at. How is he writing a story which is ostensibly pagan, fantastical, pre-Christian, and yet it is deeply Christian? But Tolkien, as a medievalist, knows that in the history of the church, the most medieval Christian thing you can do is mine the classics for their embedded preparatio evangelica, for the way that God has prepared people for the gospel. Augustine and other church fathers call it plundering the Egyptians. Augustine himself says that all truth is God's truth. So that's what Tolkien leans into in The Lord of the Rings, is to say, hey, if that's real, then I can pull from influences of any culture that I want. The Old Norse cultures, the classical Greek and Roman cultures, these things that we see as influences in Lord of the Rings. Um, and I can find all of the ways in which the truth of God shines out there and just strip away all of the dross, all of the ways that it doesn't correspond. And in the end, you find, even when you're not looking for it, this very powerful resonance because you get the purity of that message. If you can clear away all of the unbiblical stuff and you find the sort of natural theology that God has embedded in all these other cultures, it impacts you very powerfully. And that's what a lot of people do when they read The Lord of the Rings. And a lot of people do it unconsciously. And so Tolkien is all Tolkien is doing is just saying, hey, this is the way that literature flows naturally. This is the way that these stories are supposed to flow if we take out all of the obstacles. And I'm just going to let it go. And so that's what he's up to. And it's a complicated endeavor, and it would take a lot more time than even I've already taken to unpack it. But it's
Absolutely.
so integrative that it actually takes a lot to unpack the explicit strands that he uses to weave this tapestry.
Right, and it really speaks to the richness, right, that is Tolkien's writings. And I would note that that kind of presence and confluence of cultures and underlying truth not only, I think, illustrates the accessibility of Tolkien's writing and the story of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but in particular, I would note, just as a plug, that it makes this lecture and this conversation we'll engage together accessible to a great number of individuals, almost right, inconsiderate of where they are necessarily in their faith journey, right? Of course, I think this bears much for those who are Catholic and identify so to prize and enjoy, but I would invite and encourage those who are merely curious about Tolkien generally, or in particular looking for some connection between that kind of imaginative and creative act with that fundamental sense of the divine that they bear in their souls and in their hearts. I would ask you, Dr. Freeman, what hope you have as a takeaway for the audience to the lecture from that experience. What might they, or what do you hope they might bring home with them from that encounter?
Sure. A few things. So, number one, I hope that it takes people back to Tolkien's work to look at it for themselves. Now, the whole point of imaginative apologetics is that this works when you embed it within a narrative. So, for me to stand up and give you all of the propositions about what Tolkien is doing is by definition not going to be as effective as going and reading the story. So, hopefully, the audience goes back and reads maybe some of the things that they've never read before, something like Leaf by Nickel, which is one of my favorite short stories that Tolkien wrote, that is deliberately about sort of autobiographical reflection on his creative process embedded as a story. The other thing I would do is to encourage people that it's not that Tolkien is the apologist to the imagination. It's that God is the apologist to the imagination, and Tolkien is just trying to get out of the way. So Tolkien sees human nature as fundamentally creative. That is what the image of God is for him in a large part, is when we write these stories, we are participating in God's nature, or we're reflecting God's nature. And so if we do that deliberately, then we are sort of tapping into that power that God has already given us to be able to show what he's like to people. And so what that means for Tolkien and for us is that we don't have to, study Aquinas's five ways. We don't have to master Anselm's ontological argument. We don't have to keep abreast of all of the current trends in neuroscience. We just have to um, reflect upon the means that God has already given us in our everyday lives to be able to persuade people of the truth of the gospel. So it's a lot easier than many people think it is. I think that would be an encouragement that we could take away from the lecture.
Absolutely. I'm certainly encouraged, right? And I would note, especially by this conversation occurring again in the context of apologetics, which, has really become, I think, in the course of our discussion, an inviting and fecund ground for us to explore our faith and the gospel and how God is speaking to us in the narratives, not only of the literature and culture around us, but in the narratives of our lives. And it gets me a little excited for apologetics, and I want to take this opportunity as we've been discussing this to note that another opportunity is quickly coming.
Mhm.
This time from Houston Christian University, and I invite you, please, to give us a little more information on your upcoming Apologetics Day.
Sure. So I am the chair of apologetics at Houston Christian University. We've got a master's degree that sort of brands itself as doing this. So if this is something that people are compelled to do, then they can investigate. But our event is on March 22nd. It's going to be here in Houston, and we've got three keynote speakers, one of which is Holly Ordway, who is one of the scholars in residence at Robert Barron's Word on Fire Ministries. And she is a top tier Tolkien scholar. Every book on Tolkien that she brings out wins all sorts of awards. And so she's affiliated with us. She's going to come and speak on Tolkien and imaginative apologetics. We've also got the Reverend Canon Professor Trevor Hart, who we're bringing in from Scotland at the University of St. Andrews. He's going to be speaking there as well. And then we've got David Fairchild, who's one of our local pastors and leaders of a church planning network, to bring it down back to ground level and talk about the way that he uses Tolkien in his ministry, basically doing it on the street level with people that he meets. So that's on March 22nd. Registration is live. And we would love to see you all there. If this is something that you could spend all day doing, then come and spend all day doing it with us here in Houston.
Wow, that's such an exciting opportunity. I mean, certainly something that I think would, sit comfortably at table with our upcoming lecture here and welcoming you to Oblate in San Antonio. We like to close with a little bit of a fun question, and so I'm very excited to ask you this one, and that is that of the races that we see in The Lord of the Rings, hobbits, elves, dwarves, men's, even ents. Is there one that could you, choose to join or become, even for a brief period? Which do you think would be your preference?
Hmm. I think I'd have to say hobbits.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you why. Tolkien has human beings as the sort of channel for redemption in the world. And hobbits are a subcategory of human beings. People might not know that. Elves are Tolkien's way of exploring the creative aspect of humanity. And hobbits, or at least particular sorts of hobbits like Sam and Frodo and Merry and Pippin, because they've lived around the elves, they are able to elevate their more myopic tendencies to only focus on the here and now without losing the groundedness in the simplicity of the created order and our reflection on our mortality and our ultimate goal as life in God and not necessarily life in the material world. So for Tolkien, hobbits actually are the blend, or particular hobbits are the blend of a lot of the different strands that he uses these races to illustrate. So I'm going to pick the one that does the best synthesis, and I get to live in houses like this.
Well, there you go. Tried and true. Excellent choice. I want to thank you, Dr. Freeman, for your time today, for your agreeing to give this upcoming lecture on Tolkien as apologist to the imagination. It's incredible always to see how these seminal works of fantasy and really mythology and culture bearing can speak to us as a community and also in such deeply personal ways. So I thank you dearly for paying testament to that in this conversation and in our upcoming lecture.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
To our listeners, don't miss Dr. Freeman's upcoming lecture, Tolkien as Apologist to the Imagination, here at Oblate School of Theology on February 27th. Whether you attend in person or online, this is a wonderful opportunity to explore Tolkien's imaginative theology. In-person registration is only $20, whereas online attendance is $15. You can get more details and register through our website, www.ost.edu. Thanks again for tuning in to Leaving Nothing Undared, and remember until next time, to leave nothing undared in your pursuit of the gospel. God bless you.